discussion of MAHC requirements with our featured speaker, Doug Sackett. Before we begin, there are a few announcements to go over. Please use your computer speakers to listen to this presentation. And additionally, I would ask that if you used your phone line to dial into this call, if you would please either mute your phones or go ahead and just hang up your phone lines and use your computer speakers to listen to the presentation. You are encouraged to use the chat box to ask any questions that you might have throughout the duration of the webinar. And at the end of the presentation, our speakers will address your questions in the order that we received them. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be distributed to all of our participants. So before we move on to our featured presentation, as usual, we have a few updates from NACCHO, from CDC, and from the Council for the Model Aquatic Health Code. So first, just a few updates from NACCHO. World Water Day was this past Friday on March 22nd, and we have a blog post on our website, essentialelements.nacho.org, which is the essential elements of local public health. So if you're interested at all in reading some local success stories from the field, there is a compendium of those 3 success stories focusing on water, sanitation, and hygiene emergencies for World Water Day. A short update from Joe at CDC.
Hi, everybody. Real quickly, I wanted to let you folks know that we are continuing developing the mini MAHCs. Currently on the CDC website, we have the crypto prevention mini MAHC that's been made available a few months ago. We also have cleared and ready a diaper changing and hygiene mini MAHC. However, the MAHC website is undergoing some maintenance right now, and as soon as that becomes available and live again, we'll be posting that mini MAHC on there for download as well. Currently in clearance, we have 2 more. Both are chemistry related. One is about preventing exposures to pool chemicals, so safe storage and handling, and the other one is unintended gassing incidents, particularly chlorine gas incidents. Those are both in clearance and hope to have those available in the next month or 2 for everybody. On the next slide, we have an update also when the MAHC website becomes updated. We're going to make available the up-to-date with the 2018 3rd edition MAHC, our inspection form. But there were a few minor changes to the MAHC in the 3rd edition, and we accommodated the inspection form, the accompanying cheat sheet, as well as the cross-reference guide. We added a couple items in there, clarified some language. Hopefully it's going to be a little bit easier to use. That's all I had, Grace. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. So with that, we'll have some updates from the Executive Director of CMAC, who is also our presenter for today. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Douglas Sackett, who has been serving in this function as the first Executive Director as the CMAC since 2014. Prior to this, he built a strong record of aquatics leadership, working for the New York State Department of Health for 38 years, and retired as the Assistant Director of the Bureau of Community Environmental Health and Food Protection in April 2013. During this tenure, he worked in the swimming pool and bathing beach programs, in addition to numerous other environmental health regulatory programs. And Doug was the Director and Steering Committee member for CDC's project to develop the National Model Aquatic Health Code from its inception in 2007 until the first edition was launched in August of 2014. So welcome, Doug. Thank you for being here. And we look forward to hearing first your updates from CMAC and then your featured presentation. So thanks.
Thanks, Grace, and welcome everybody this afternoon. Some brief updates from CMAC. I want to touch base on the CMAC certification program, some work that's going to be going on with our ad hoc committees, and some membership items. So first, our CMAQ certification program, for those that aren't familiar, that's a new program we started last fall where we're certifying services or products that comply with standards that are spelled out in the Model Aquatic Health Code, and we can issue the CMAQ certified label to that. The update is our first product was Councilman Hunsaker's Facility Manager web-based app. We've since approved and certified Pool Shark H2O web-based app. We have 2 other web-based apps that are under review right now, and we expect in the near future to be posting those as approved too. You can see we've got the web address from our website where you can go and find the certified programs. Once we clear out these web-based apps, expect to move into opening applications for the pool operator training type programs, lifeguard and lifeguard manager programs. We'll be working through all those programs, evaluating them as the program sponsors choose if they submit applications, and then have them posted once they've been approved or considered compliant with the MAHC. Some CMAQ ad hoc committees, we've got some work going on, but we do have some new committees that are planned, and one right now, the spray ground, the spray park, or the interactive water venue, as we call them in the MAHC, the design criteria. We're in the process of selecting members for an ad hoc committee. We want the committee to take a look at the current design criteria in the MAHC and see if there needs to be any updates. Particularly, we had some change requests relating to UV treatment with the last go-round, but we deferred that, even though it was passed by membership, deferred it till we have the complete spray ground design reevaluated to see how that fits in. We're still looking at putting together a pool shell design where we're going to be looking at, the basic safety issues, underwater shells, benches, and the like, and a new program too on advanced oxidation processes. A lot of folks are interested in that. A lot of health departments are being contacted by manufacturers of these processes or products, and so we're going to put together an ad hoc committee to take a look at this, see where they fit in and what kind of standards should be looked at for determining how they fit in and what to be looking at for those. And lastly, just an update or a reminder that you need to renew your membership. All memberships in CMAQ expired at the end of the last conference cycle, which was November 2017, and it's open for membership now for renewals. It has been, and you need to be a member to be able to vote, and we'd like to encourage folks to update. If you haven't joined before, join now. If you haven't renewed, please renew now to be part of the process. I appreciate that. And just some information for CDC's website and CMAQ website. And from there, I will be moving into our feature presentation on flotation tanks, review and discussion of MAHC requirements. What I want to do is we're going to be talking about the public health rationale for regulating flotation tanks. I want to go through the MAHC requirements for disinfection, circulation, filtration, the cleaning, biofilm control, and fecal blood vomit contamination responses, but not just indicate what they are, but I wanted to get into some of the discussions of why, what's the rationale behind and the defense behind some of the criteria in the MAHC. So we'll start out with flotation tanks in general. This is the definition out of the Model Aquatic Health Code. It would be a float tank, float room, isolation tank, sensory deprivation tank. It means a tub that contains a saturated solution of magnesium sulfate having a specific gravity of the 1.23 to 1.3. It provides light and sound reduced environment and maintained at a temperature of approximately 92 to 96 degrees. And another is a flotation tank solution. We have to try and be careful with terminology because a lot of times we say float tank water. Those folks that are involved in the float tanks and own and operate them, it isn't water the same as a swimming pool. It's a saturated solution of magnesium sulfate with the specific gravity of in this range of 1.23 to 1.3. So it is liquid, it is a solution, but it's not just pure water. So just want to highlight that. So why regulate flotation tanks? We hear frequently that they're not, the health department, why are they involved? It's not a swimming pool. Why are you involved in regulating this? One of the things, well, there's a number of items that I want to go through here is starting out with probably the widest overarching item of why we regulate, when we as health departments typically regulate an aquatic venue, a pool, spa, hot tub, is we're differentiating between, say, a private residential pool, spa, or we'll throw in float tank, where the users are the owners. So the water and the environment that you're exposed to, the user is the owner and has total control of what that environment is, the health and safety aspects of that. Now, in the types of facilities or the settings that we, the health departments, regulate are those where another entity, an owner operator, has control of the maintenance and operation, and the patron's health and safety is dependent on the operation and maintenance by this other entity, an owner or operator. And that's where the health department oversight comes in, as we're to be providing for health and safe environment that the general public, if you will, can potentially be exposed to health and safety considerations, and the individual doesn't own it, doesn't have control of that environment, so they're totally relying on someone else to provide for their health and safety in that environment. So that's kind of the broadest overview. Then we look at float solutions are not drained and refilled between users. So again, we look at something that's not owned by an individual, but let's take an example of a jetted tub, large jetted tub in a hotel room. Do we regulate those? No, mainly because it's dumped and drained between users. So the potential for disease transmission is greatly reduced because it's drained and refilled between users, whereas float solutions are not drained and refilled between users. So the general public is exposed to this water, this solution, again, that's intended for recreational therapeutic purposes, and there's the potential for disease transmission. There's a risk, and the routes of exposure are there, but they are, we point out, they are much different than a typical swimming pool, and we'll get into that a little bit later. Pathogens, another reason why we regulate. Pathogens can survive in float solution. Repeated use, meaning it's not dumped and drained, could further compromise water quality. And then there's some other health and safety related issues, such as electrical safety, slips and falls with this salt solution, this Epsom salts. It can be very slippery environment. So again, the intent of the regulations is to provide for the health and safety of those folks using it. Now, the overview of disinfection, just from what the MAHC does require, it's disinfection by either ozone or UV treatment systems. And this is, the next bullet is different than what most health departments would be embracing from a public health standpoint. Chlorine or bromine or halogen is not required. Hydrogen peroxide, however, is not acceptable as a disinfectant. And again, I'm going to get into more details of the rationale behind each of these statements in subsequent slides. Additionally, the ozone and UV must meet a 3-log reduction of influent bacteria disinfection efficacy, and we spell out the NSF standard on that. And what that means broadly is the bacteria coming in, or the pathogens or contaminants coming into the UV unit or the ozone unit. So it's unlike a halogen where you've got a residual out in the vessel of water, and any contaminants or pathogens come in contact with that halogen out in that vessel of water, and the inactivation or disinfection occurs there. With an ozone and UV system, you must take the water from that vessel, put it through the unit, reduce the levels by a 3-log reduction. That's the performance efficacy we specify, and that reduced concentration of pathogens is then returned to the vessel of water, and you continually go through that process, and it's a process of consecutive dilutions, essentially dilution of the contaminants in their concentration, until you hit a level of what we're looking for, less than an infectious dose. So that's where the 3-log reduction comes in. It's a performance of the ozone or the UV system. It's not a 3-log reduction out in the vessel. It's the performance criteria of that unit. And from there, you can size and get into how the systems are sized. And again, ozone, there's some requirements. They meet the ozone levels as specified in the NSF ANSI standard. Again, ozone with excessive or higher concentrations can be harmful to health. So the concern when designing these that they're designed appropriately so that your ozone levels in the solution do not exceed 0.1 ppm, because that's going to dictate what gases off the potential concentration in the air, which is where the harm can be encountered if you have high levels of ozone in the air. So also calibrated UV sensors are required. Again, we don't have a halogen. We can't measure a residual, so we're relying on proper operation of the UV and or ozone. And from a UV, the sensors are what monitors if we're getting the required dosage so that we know that we're getting that 3-log reduction per pass. Because without any kind of sensors, you're making an assumption that it's doing the job, but you have no way of monitoring that without a proper calibrated sensor. And there's a variety of different conditions and circumstances that can affect the performance of those UVs, you know, the lamp output and the water conditions. So it's important to have those calibrated sensors. Now we get into some of the rationale again. Why don't we have chlorine or bromine in the pool? Well, when we had our ad hoc committee that developed these requirements in the Model Aquatic Health Code, there was a concern by the float industry about the air quality aesthetics. If you have that chlorine smell and the halogen-related disinfection byproducts with use of the chlorine and bromine, it's trying to have a nice, peaceful, sensory-deprived environment, and if you have the chlorine smell or some of these other issues, disinfection byproducts, it detracts from that whole experience. There's also, as pointed out, or concern about the ability to accurately test your chlorine or bromine in this Epsom salt solution. Also, some of the rationale is it's used only by one person typically. You do have some 2-person tanks, but typically a 1 person at a time. The routes of exposure, our ingestion, inhalation, and contact are limited. And again, I'm going to get into each of these in more detail in subsequent slides. And again, the pathogens of concern, they may be able to persist or survive for short term, but they're unlikely to readily grow in this environment. And also, we determined that the ability to adequately disinfect between users with the ozone or UV is there. So now, one of the other items, or the items that pointed out, is there the concern or question about the ability to properly test for free total chlorine. And there was an NSF study, and they analyzed 3 different methods for measuring this, and there was questions about the accuracy, measurement accuracy, and the ability to the repeatability of this. So I just put this in. Don't have to go through this in detail, but the point is, it's still in question how accurate it is. I do know that a lot of departments out there that do regulate float tanks mandate chlorine in the water. Haven't really been able to determine how this is, how they address this issue as far as the accuracy of the testing, the repeatability of the testing method. Another item is, as I point out, hydrogen peroxide is not acceptable as a disinfectant. A lot of the existing float tanks out there, they'll typically, I say typically, but see UV systems along with hydrogen peroxide. The levels that are typically recommended for flotation tanks we've seen is 50 to 100 parts per million is not likely to be effective if you're reliant on that as a disinfectant. Plus EPA, hydrogen peroxide is not an EPA registered disinfectant or sanitizer for recreational water. But having said that, we do not prohibit use of hydrogen peroxide. It can be used as a water conditioner or an oxidizer or to help enhance or provide for better water quality. But what we're saying is it's not being accepted to claim as a disinfectant. It's not given credits as a disinfectant, but it's not prohibited. I want to point that out. Okay. And again, when I said used by one person at a time, sometimes two, well, what relevance does that have with disinfection and our requirements? Well, the potential exposure to pathogens shed from other bathers, such as you have in pools and spas, you don't have that situation in the individual float sessions. The bacteria shed by in a swimming pool, you've got your chlorine in there, or your bromine. You've got pathogens and contaminants being shed by bathers, and the person swimming next to you can be exposed to that. So you're relying on that disinfectant residual to make sure that you don't have transmission between patrons. As you can see in a float tank with one person at a time, during the individual float sessions, the potential exposure is not there because of the nature of the beast. You're just not, you don't have multiple people in there and having that spread of, potential spread of pathogens. Now we look at even the routes of exposure. Even if you do have pathogens in there, where typically it's the ingestion, inhalation, or contact, they are limited compared to a swimming pool or a spa. The ingestion, which is your GI type illness, is less likely due to the manner of floating. You're on your back, your face, mouth is out of the water, and the palatability of the tank water is not very good. It's a very bitter taste. So it's highly unlikely that you're going to have the ingestion pathway that's going to lead to a GI type illness. Next, we look at the inhalation. You can have the respiratory, such as Legionella type exposure. But again, that's likely to be minimal or reduced based on there's little or no agitation at all during this float session. Again, the concept is nice, tranquil, peaceful environment, so you do not have that agitation, which would promote the aerosolization of these organisms. So that inhalation through that is less likely, very minimal because of that. And then the last one is where we look at is the contact with the skin and ear canals. It does occur. Eye contact is probably unlikely, and if it does, it's not going to be very long-lived because it's extremely irritating to the eyes by salt. I also understand a lot of folks, your ear canals are exposed. Some folks, they use earplugs, but it doesn't. That is a possible route of exposure. So again, we've very much minimized or eliminated the ingestion route, the inhalation route, and we're back with a contact type route of potential pathogens and exposure. So now we look at, okay, if we do have pathogens, what are the pathogens of concern? Are they able to, they may be able to persist or survive for short term, but it's not likely to readily grow. And there's a couple different studies that were done at the request of some of the float tank community, a couple different groups where NSF tested, looked at the various organisms and their ability to survive in the float water. And actually the summary of conclusions, I kind of combined the two because the outcome's pretty similar. Is the Pseudomonas aeruginosa appeared to be the most sensitive of all the organisms that were exposed to the product water. After 24 hours, it was undetectable in this water. And again, remember to the previous slide where contact was our probably most likely potential route of exposure. Pseudomonas is what we're talking about, but here it's very sensitive to the product water, meaning it's not going to survive, persist for long. There's a couple other, the Candida albicans, which is a fungus or a yeast, a fungus, and is second most sensitive. The Enterococcus was one of the more resistant organisms in the study, but that's more of a fecal oral. So again, your route of exposure is not going to be come into play much. And this Aspergillus niger, again, those are most resistant to the product water. Little change in concentration over a 24-hour period, and that again is another a fungus type organism. So now we look at the ability of what we may have in there, as far as pathogens. We look at the ability to adequately disinfect between users with ozone or UV. Because again, we're, as I said before, with one person at a time, essentially, you're not worried about the infections occurring or passing the pathogens during the float. So we're relying on disinfection between users so that the next person, whatever may be shed or contaminants brought in by the one user before the next person uses the float tank, it's been adequately disinfected. So we looked at UV alone, and there was some initial concerns about UV alone because it has demonstrated the resistance of some viral pathogens to UV disinfection, even with some relatively high doses of UV. But and based on that, we're originally looking at maybe we don't go with UV alone. But when we pursued that a bit more and delved into that, there's a limited number of viral pathogens that did demonstrate that resistance to UV alone, and their routes of exposure were typically the fecal-oral route. So again, plugging it back into the big picture, yes, they may be somewhat resistant or quite resistant to UV, but what's the likelihood we're going to encounter those in this float environment, or where they're going to be an issue in this environment? And again, I just stress here that calibrated UV sensors are required, again, with the ability to adequately disinfect. Again, we need that. It's necessary to assure the appropriate treatment, that we're getting the dose that we think we're getting to do the disinfection. Excuse me. So next step in the treatment is the filtration, turnover, and circulation. We say the MAHC says a minimum of 3 volumetric turnovers between users. And again, remember, we're getting our disinfection or inactivation between users. So there's float tank system controllers. I don't believe every system has a controller, but I think it's a common type control system. And the MAHC says the minimum time to achieve the 3 volumetric turnovers has to be built in as a default, meaning and if the controller lacks that capability to set a default filtration time, the time required to be posted adjacent to the controller, so whoever is the person operating it is aware of it. And again, we'll get into the details of why the 3 volumetric turnovers, but this is the key to what we consider adequate disinfection. It goes back to, again, the 3 log reduction per pass. We're taking the water out of the unit through this treatment system and back out. And there's got to be a certain number of passes, and with considering the 3 log reduction per pass, so we are comfortable that we don't have a pathogen problem between users. And there's a couple others. If the design uses an external holding reservoir where all the water from the float tank goes to an external reservoir, then all the water must pass through the filtration disinfection before being returned to the float tank. I don't know how prevalent they are, but those type of systems do exist. And then we further say that 4 volumetric turnovers at the end of each day, and then when you're ready to fire up in the morning at the day, 1 volumetric turnover before first use of the day. So that's what the MAHC requires. Now we'll get into some of the rationale for that. And again, as I said, the adequate disinfection is totally reliant on this consecutive dilution of the tank solution contaminants. So as I said, the solution is brought through the filter and the ozone or UV system. We get a 3 log reduction per pass, and it goes back out into the in the vessel. So let's see. I was trying to use my pointer here, but I don't see that working. If we look at this laws of dilution and Gage Bidwell, if we look at 3 turnovers here, we're getting 95% of the water is over the period of time is going through the treatment system. So if we originally looked at 5 turnovers because we didn't have a disinfectant residual, so at 5 turnovers, and I'm not sure why. Oh, there we are. So 5 turnovers here, you've got 99.3% of the water is being gone through the treatment system. At 3 turnovers, we've got 95%. Let's see. So the question is 3 volumetric turnovers, which I said 95% of total volume of solution treated, is that enough? So some of the things we looked at, again, because we started out with 5 turnovers, but we had some comments and input and discussions from some of the ad hoc committee members and some of the constituents that they represented. That could be problematic in what you've got to remember is that this turnover is going to, these 3 volumetric turnovers has to occur between users. So the longer the calculations you have to do of how many gallons per minute and how many minutes it's going to take to go through this 3 volumetric turnovers or the 5 volumetric turnovers, it increases the time between patrons. And it can significantly reduce the number of people that you can cycle through in a day's time. So we're asked to really look at it and what is actually needed to get the level of water quality and the pathogen reduction that we're looking at. So again, we went back and looked at, okay, the routes of exposure, primarily contact, no ingestion. So then we look at the potential concentration of pathogens, and we're looking what are you likely to see in there. Again, let's look at Pseudomonas because that's our contact type situation. And so what's the concentration that you can expect in there if you have somebody shedding, and then what's the infectious dose? So going through a little kind of a process, so we compare the concentration you expect in this typical volume of 250 gallons, what might have been introduced into that 250 gallons, and just with a dilution of that concentration within that of pathogens within that volume vessel water, what is the level of that compared to what an infectious dose is? And then you also consider that you're reducing that concentration by 3 log per pass. So one example was looking at a study that used Pseudomonas, and they looked at the initial, and this was some spa hot tub studies, but the initial contamination load introduced, then you look at considered the dilution using 250 gallons, and we looked at what the resulting concentration was. Just in and of itself of the dilution of 250 gallons of water, you had a concentration 1,000 times below what is estimated threshold for infectivity before you even put in any disinfection treatment. So I think that went a long way to saying, okay, we don't necessarily need 5 turnovers. And again, the focus of the turnover is really, yes, you're getting filtration from a turbidity removal, but we're really looking at it as a delivery system, if you will, for the UV or ozone. It's our way to manage our disinfection. So just going back, sorry about that. So again, we justified going from the 5 to 3 with all these kind of nuances of flotation tanks, separate and different from a swimming pool or a spa pool, and felt comfortable that we're adequately addressing any potential health consequences from pathogens in there with requiring either UV or ozone minus any halogen, but dependent on proper design and operation of the UV or ozone system and proper design of your circulation system to yield the number of turnovers so that you do result in the treatment levels that we expect. The next item to be concerned about potentially is this cleaning your biofilm control, especially without a halogen, without chlorine or bromine. You don't have that contact of anything that may be building up on the interior surfaces, particularly at the water line. So the MAHC, to address that, because we don't have a halogen in there, is the interior surfaces at waterline to be scrubbed daily. We're looking to prevent the buildup of slime and biofilm layers. We don't want the harboring of some of these organisms or Legionella or any of these type of things that can persist in the biofilm. So absent of your chemical disinfection, we're relying on manual operations, scrubbing that to make sure that we don't have a biofilm buildup. So that's on a daily basis. On a weekly basis, we want the interior surface of the tank to be scrubbed or wiped down thoroughly on a weekly basis, and then the tank's drained and all interior surfaces scrubbed or wiped down prior to refilling at a frequency necessary to prevent buildup of slime or biofilm. That means that the facility operator and manager has got to be keeping an eye on that, knowing what we're trying to prevent or control. If you start indications that you've got a buildup, then you need to have this thoroughly cleaned and scrubbed down to prevent that biofilm buildup. So as, again, kind of summarizing that rationale, there is no halogen residual to provide contact disinfection of the surfaces. When we look at UV, it doesn't provide any contact disinfection of the surfaces except within the UV cell itself. On the other hand, ozone treatment can provide some cleaning, and we've had some reports from folks that do use the ozone in between time because it's got relatively longer half-life, about 8 minutes at certain conditions. So if you've got between users, you've got the ozonator going, you got all this agitation going, so you've got this ozone in there, and it kind of chemically is scrubbing the inside of the tank and all the features within that tank. So ozone, you probably can expect to get some control of any potential biofilms. But nonetheless, we do want the control of biofilm or the slime through the routine physical scrubbing and wiping the surfaces down as necessary. And last type items is our fecal vomit blood contamination response, where we deviate a little bit or different from what the typical pool spa contamination response is. It does require, this still does require immediate closure if you've got a fecal or vomit contamination. If you've got form, stool, or blood contamination, you can operate the filtration and disinfection systems for at least the minimum required volumetric turnovers, which in the case of the it's the minimum 3 turnovers between users. If you've got diarrheal or vomit contamination, you want complete draining of the tank solution and the contaminated surface is disinfected prior to refilling. It's just too hard to remove, and if you treat it, if you've got the liquid in there. So that is different than what for a swimming pool, and it's separately addressing specific to float tanks because, again, the MAHC, the existing requirements in the MAHC are based on chlorine concentrations and CT values. So it's because we don't have the chlorine in this environment, we've got different specific criteria for the float tanks. And those are the last items that I wanted to highlight and get into the details of the rationale and discussion of how we came to proposing and actually having those criteria in the MAHC. So here's contact information, and I think Grace will be open for questions at this point.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Doug, for that great presentation and for providing some of the rationale and scientific background to these regulations. We do have quite a few questions, so I'll go ahead and get started, and we'll move through them as quickly as possible in the order we got them. So one of our first questions was asking for a citation that pathogens actually can survive in a float tank solution. Do you have any more information on the science behind that?
I just want to point out, too, that the MAHC, the annex in the MAHC is some detailed discussions about pretty much everything I discussed here, and we have our list of references, and there are, we do have those references. I think I tried to include those NSF studies, at least 2 different studies that NSF conducted specific to float tank water, their solution.
Awesome, thanks, Doug. We had a question in reference to someone commented that they thought that chlorine and bromine were also not allowed due to FIFRA.
Yeah, I'm not sure how detailed to get into there. There's been discussions back and forth as does chlorine or bromine, is it really relevant in this float tank water, you know, the specific language in the EPA standards and all that. And I really am not prepared to get into that. It's beyond some of the nuances to that are beyond my my knowledge, I should say, at this time. But it's really, if we go to, there's a difference between the peroxide and the chlorine or bromine in the sense that the hydrogen peroxide at the levels you need to be a disinfectant. I mean, they use it as contact surface disinfectants, but the levels you need in solution to be a disinfectant is far, far, far higher than what the typical concentrations that they use for the oxidation or for the water polishing type events. So it's kind of, yeah, there's relevance to the FIFRA, but they're kind of different beasts too when you're looking at disinfection. And that's probably not a great answer, but I don't know what else to say on that at this point.
Sure. We had a comment just come in that said from EPA, chlorine and bromine do not have registered use sites for float tanks. So sounds like, parallel to what you were saying in the comments as well. We have another question. Does the high salt create clarity issues that affect the effectiveness of UV treatment?
And that's a good question. And that, again, goes back to the sensor and having the UV units validated. And the sensor is going to be measuring or monitoring for the appropriate dose to be effective. And if you don't meet the dose, you're going to get an alarm. So if you have conditions in the water that are going to affect that UV light penetration or that sensor picking it up, you're going to have an alarm, you're going to have a problem. You're going to know that you've got an issue. So yeah, there are different conditions. I'm not sure if the salt itself, I've looked into that, I've got some feedback on that, I just can't recall without looking at my notes what that is. But again, the sensor is going to monitor for that in a sense, on are you getting the dosage or not from what the sensor's reading.
Great, thanks, Doug. Next question was, since the float tanks are enclosed, what kind of controls are effective against the buildup of ozone gas inside the unit?
And that's another great question. And one of the things that the committee we did look at, too, was the ventilation, particularly within the unit itself. And we've got wording in the MAHC. It's not specific prescriptive. It's more performance-based because there is a concern about not only, well, see, the ozone can be somewhat addressed through the NSF testing and the sizing of it, but also, has to, as far as monitoring by the operator too, but just build up looking at, carbon dioxide and different, just enclosed with respirations, what's going on. So we had discussions, but no hard and fast answers to that other than having kind of some performance criteria language and to require ventilation as necessary to make sure that you've got acceptable air quality. And I'm paraphrasing, I'm not looking at the code, but that's how we address it.
Question's a little bit out of order because we just had a question come in about if anyone is using AOP systems, a combination of ozone and UV, and then another one earlier on about if hydrogen peroxide is effective when used in conjunction with UV. So the two, hydrogen peroxide and ozone in conjunction with UV, are those effective in the float tanks?
And again, the hydrogen peroxide, I think it does, it's, my knowledge is it's an oxidizer. So yes, it's going to be effective on water contaminants and helping to improve the water. It's just not, we're not looking at it as pathogen disinfection, but from a water quality standpoint, it's typically used with UV for that reason, to enhance water quality from oxidizing organics and the like. So.
Got it. Sort of related to that, have there been any documented outbreaks yet that have occurred related to float tanks?
I'd have to go back. It's not something that you see a lot of. There is, I can't answer for sure what the numbers are. It's not zero, but I don't know what the circumstances or situations are. But it's a good question because it goes back to kind of my first slide is folks, particularly in the float industry, saying, we don't hear of outbreaks, we don't hear of illnesses. What's the point? Why is it being regulated? And I just defer to my first slides of here's the public health rationale, or kind of a precautionary principle on that. On yes, the potential's there. We're trying to acknowledge and recognize there are differences and what the relative risks are, and having the design operational criteria try to match the relative risks and providing a basic level of safety and sanitation.
Makes sense to me. So let's see. There is a question about if there was a filtration system with the unit, and then I think you went ahead and answered that in your slides, that there is a filtration system with it.
Yep.
So next question was, let's see. For those of us who have to use chlorine as a sanitation method, how concerned should we be about the off-gassing of chlorine gases?
Disinfection byproducts. And that, again, that would probably go more to the ventilation too, similar to, an indoor pools. And if you have contaminants and precursors and your chlorine reacting and you have disinfection byproducts, proper ventilation within the unit would be appropriate. But my guess is, and I'm talking to some of the float tank folks, and they can probably better speak to this than I can, but the contamination burden that comes into them is probably much less. From what I understand, it's typical to require showering before you go into the tank. It's I think it's more the norm to go in without suits or clothing on and showering before. So you're reducing, presumably, significantly any contamination burden for any of those precursors that you're pulling into there to start with. So that would minimize your disinfection byproducts. But again, it would be more probably what the levels are and what your ventilation to control any airborne, like the trichloramines for disinfection byproducts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another couple questions about the air quality inside tanks. We had someone ask Janella, and related to that, if there's any risk of biofilm.
I think there is probably the general risk of biofilm building up, and that's why we talk about, highlight the need for maintenance of it on a daily, weekly, and beyond that schedule to make sure that you control it and don't allow it to take hold. So we're relying on proper operation and maintenance to control biofilm in the absence of a residual. And even with the residual, if you don't, even in the pools, with chlorine or bromine in there, you can still have buildups that you require some manual scrubbing to stay on top of it. So really need proper maintenance to stay on top of it.
Right. We have, moving on, another question about if the pump curves have been modified to account for high SG, I guess, standard gravity float water.
And I don't know. That's a good question. I know that's come up too with some of the float tank folks. NSF currently has a task group revisiting the float tank requirements or standards, and not only in the pump curves but on drains. From a Virginia Graham Baker standpoint, how is it taken into account, the specific gravity and all that when you're looking at the flows through that? And I don't have a good answer for that. I don't have an answer for that. I just don't know.
Mm-hmm. All good. We had another person ask, why wouldn't the 5 cycles of turnover take place at the end of the day in order to ensure that almost all the water is treated? We had a follow-up comment from someone that they recycle at the end of the day altogether. Is that the case, that the units will continue to cycle through?
It's probably variable. It is a good question. We went from 5 down to 4, and I just don't remember how we landed on the 4 other than the level of protection we're getting, and based on all the factors that we came to that surrounded that. But it's a good question. I don't remember why we went from 5 to 4. And as far as does it continue to cycle, I'm not sure what the practices are. The float tank folks can probably respond to that, but my sense is it probably does not recirculate when it's other than you have you're cycling at the end of the day to clean it up, but then then it's shut down, and we just wanted it run in the morning, and again, running through your UV or ozone before the first customers, but I don't think that they run continuously during non-use times.
Got it. Thanks for clarifying. Let's see. There was a comment that there was a study with Pseudomonas using an organism that has low survival in the tank solution, and a follow-up question asking if there have been any culture tests performed. Just related to that, there's also some discussion going on about potentially a Pseudomonas case in Vancouver. So just some questions about culture tests and, again, back to pathogen survival in the tanks.
And I know there's a bit of work going on there. Some of the float tank folks have commissioned some folks to be microbiologists and all to be looking at some of these, the cultures and the testing. But I know that the two NSF studies were doing some of the cultures, and they showed in the water, non-float tank water, Pseudomonas thrived, and grew in the 24 hours, where in the float tank water it did not. So, I mean, you might want to take a look at again, the annex to the MAHC sites has a specific references. You can look those references up, get right to the NSF studies that dealt with that for more details. And I'm sure, and probably some of the float tank folks, I know Ashkan and Graham and Shoshone, they are involved in a lot of these, studies too, and they may have some more information on that. As far as the Pseudomonas outbreak, my speculation would have to go to, is there biofilm control? How's the water quality? What's the level of treatment in there, and biofilm control in the units? It just may not be. It's possible that it could relate, and we see a lot with the swimming pool or spa environment. It's kind of a function of the level of maintenance on some of these.
Okay, got it. Sort of related to maintenance, a broader question is, what are the expectations for filtration? I guess maybe flow rate and turnover and things like that specifically?
Well, it would be, we require the filtration, but the driver, so the turnover rate's going to be dictated by the 3 volumetric turnovers between users. So it's a different approach. So if, say, an owner wants 15 minutes maximum between users, then they've got to design it and calculate what turnover, what flow rates, pumping rates you need based on the gallonage of that unit to get, so you can accomplish the 3 turnovers within that specified time. And then you back into the filtration, their filtration rate, so many gallons per minute per square foot. Again, you select your filters to accommodate your selected recirc rate that you need. So it's a different approach than saying, here we need specified turnover rate, here's your GPM. It's like, okay, here's what you need to accomplish, and you choose what time frame. Do you have an hour between users, or do you want 5 minutes between users? That's going to dictate what your flow rate needs, and then you size everything else accordingly. But then that's why it's critical. That's why it's critical that times be plugged in or managed, because you're relying on the proper treatment by having it operate as designed. So if you design it and turn over in half an hour, and then you turn people in at 15 minutes, you're not necessarily getting the treatment that you expect, and water quality and disease potential then becomes more of a concern.
Mm-hmm. I have a clarifying part to that question, which was actually that they were asking about the filter media, about what's used in the float tanks.
Again, we would still be deferring to your normal NSF-listed filters.
Okay, got it.
As you would for pools. Yep.
Sounds good. Everyone is, I think, commenting in the chat that they'd like to get a copy of this report that someone has mentioned. So I'll just go ahead and the original poster, I have the whole record of the conversation here. I can ask Iris when this is published to go ahead and send it out to everyone who's participated in this webinar. So, so thanks all for providing your emails, but I can also connect with them individually and we can get them out to you. Okay, we're coming up near the end of the presentation. 5 more minutes. We did have a question about how many states or counties are regulating flow tanks and who's responsible for that regulation?
That's a good, I do not know. I don't have a good inventory on who's regulating. Again, the float community may be more aware of that. I know we have increasingly over the years contacted by, we mean CMAC and CDC, from health departments, because they are out there. They're becoming more and more common, and when they're typically the health department regulations haven't addressed them, because they don't fit the nice little niche or profile of what a swimming pool is, so that so they're not covered. And if you try to fit them in to pool regs, it's a disservice. It's not appropriate because of all the variables, differences I explained. So some have picked up and created their own. Others have been looking for some standardized requirements. I don't have a good handle. Maybe it would be good if folks could email in. I don't know if you want it, Grace, as a response to this, or they can send us at CMAC on who's regulating in what jurisdictions. But it's typically, it would be the health department's environmental health folks that would be overseeing swimming pools or spa pools. My assumption would be the same folks that would be regulating the float tank environment.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. That's a good question. I think we at NACHO would be interested to know that too. All right, getting close to the end, so I think we have maybe just one more question, and that is where the water needs to be drained, if it goes to the sewer, if it's attached to the main drains, or to other kind of water disposal system.
And I think that is best addressed on a local level because it's wastewater management type, and it'd be the local jurisdictions, whether it's their environmental conservation or whether health departments, or who dictates or oversees appropriate wastewater or water disposal. So it's not a one answer fits all. I think you really have to go to your local jurisdiction and how is that water treated and or considered, and what are the requirements more on a local site-specific situation.
All right, fantastic, Doug. Thank you so much for this really thorough presentation. Everyone had some great questions, so I thank you all. We look forward to seeing you at our next Model Aquatic Health Code webinar. If you'd like to be added to the list, make sure to send your name and affiliation to mahcnet@nacho.org, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
The chairperson has disconnected. The conference will now